So I'll start off with Sean. So Sean is an investment analyst at Aura Ventures.
First definitely goes first.
Aura Ventures is a venture capital firm backing category-defining technology companies and has over $160 million under management. They operate in both Australia and Southeast Asia with some prominent names in their portfolio like Lygon and Zipnex. I'll move on to Alyse Sue. So Alyse Sue is the founding member of FuturDAO, a DAO that supports Web3 projects focused on climate and longevity, as well as being the founding member of Transhumanism Coin and the head of Web3 at Palo IT. And finally, we've got Daniel Barr, who is the founder of Bitfwd Capital, a boutique hedge fund and venture builder firm. Bitfwd Capital is both an investor in Web3 products, but also collaborates with Web3 companies to help build and commercialize decentralized technologies. So with the introduction sorted, I'll move on to our first question, which is, we've seen the evolution of, Web 1 to Web 2 and now Web 3. I was hoping that all three of you could shed a bit of light on what actually is Web 3.
Yeah, it's an awesome question. I think there's a very lack of transparency about what the word actually means. I think the easiest way to define it is by example, at least for me. And that's an internet where you can connect your wallet with. And to just elaborate on why I think it's a useful definition is because Web3 is fundamentally about the financialization of everything and a new payment rail for the internet. And so I think the easiest way of defining it and understanding it is just an internet that you can interact with through your wallet, which opens up a whole bunch of different incentives and products you can create.
That's really beautifully explained. I would probably just say that Web3 for me is just a movement towards three things: greater privacy, ownership, and security. So with the ownership, it's usually represented by tokens. And I'm not too sure about the privacy and security, given if we're using public networks, then all your data is out there in the open.
Yeah, I think broadly speaking, it's probably correct. And it's maybe good to rehash where does the term come from originally. I think we've been using the term for probably roughly 5 years or so. And only in this last, I'd say like half a year or maybe up to 1 year, it's really started becoming a bit more like taking off as a mainstream thing. It used to be a synonym for the decentralized web, which I wish we would still be there. Decentralized web technologies are basically, serverless hyperstructures. But then came kind of like the Silicon Valley vibe of how to do commercialization is, Web 1 is read, Web 2 is read and write, and Web 3 is read, write, and own, which is when you connect your wallet, you are able to potentially interact with assets that you are either owning them or controlling certain aspect of manipulating them almost solely at the discretion of your wallet. So I think a lot of what we see as Web3 now is that, but I think the roots, it's good to understand that the roots come from proper decentralized web technologies, which sometime Web3 that we see today is a little bit compromised of that, but I'm sure we'll get into this topic later in the discussion.
Yeah, awesome. And so given you guys are investors in the Web3 space, I'm sure every day there are some like interesting projects that are just coming across your desk. So can you tell us a little bit about some of the more exciting investments that you guys have made in the Web3 space? So Alyse, maybe you could start us off this time.
So currently the investment DAO that I run, we are just closing out our round and we're now just starting to look at some investments, though the current market has actually affected us. So we're just kind of waiting it out a little, just thinking about what our strategy is. So we focus on climate and healthy longevity, as mentioned before. These are quite niche areas, but we are seeing a lot of interesting projects in carbon at the moment. So I work with a few clients in the carbon space. And so everybody both in the regulated and the voluntary carbon credits area, they're looking at tokenizing. And now people are thinking about the implications legally, what it means for them. Do they have the same rights attached to, say, a tokenized carbon credit as the same as they would have for like the real world carbon credits right now? So some of the interesting ones in Australia is Beta Carbon. So they have tokenized regulated carbon credits, which it's increasing liquidity and transparency in the carbon markets. So this is what I'm really excited about, because based on personal experience, I have tried to buy carbon credits myself, regulated ones, but I came across a couple of barriers. So 3 I could name, which is 1, I had to be part of a corporation. 2, I had to do it through some banker or broker, investment bank normally. And then 3, I actually had to go bid at some auction. So I think that is a really interesting area. An area that I don't personally or invest in or through any investment vehicle, but which I find very interesting is fashion. So fashion in Web3, so specifically NFTs, there's a lot happening there, and I don't think it's very saturated yet. So I haven't invested in any fashion NFT projects, I should say, but I am working with a couple of clients in that area. So I think we're going to see a lot more activity and investment in this in the coming years.
There's 2 things that are interesting to think of when thinking about how to deploy capital across the stack. Sometimes funds have a certain theme or thesis. So I have some friends who are focused on metaverse. So they invest in metaverse technologies that could be games, that could be infrastructure for metaverse, or it could be finance or decentralized finance in that context, right? For us, we don't invest in one segment. We basically invest across the stack. And the rationale for that is that we have a lot of developer relationship that are really good, just from the history of the stuff that we've done with running open source hackathons for blockchain and stuff. And then we basically don't really, like at the early stage, we are agnostic to the specific field or like specific segment of the stack that people are working on, and more curious about the actual, the competency, the integrity, and the kind of intellect that people have. So you know how it goes with Naval, what he says, high intellect, high integrity, and high energy. So if we identify the 3 of those, which typically people that we know for years are already vetted, then we invest. And maybe a couple of examples to give is maybe something quite interesting is a space science. So there is a project that is using cube satellites with mounted Raspberry Pis and auxiliary hardware for trusted execution environments or secure enclave that is then doing confidential computing. And these things have been around in some context. And now when we have blockchain applications that require outsourced confidential computing not to be on chain, then this company called CryptoSat is doing those things, launched the first satellite a few weeks ago in May, and now working on second satellite. And maybe don't tell anyone, but also considering working on a layer 1 based on mesh network of CubeSat. So this is one super interesting project, for example. Another one, and maybe this is like a totally different mental model, is, Elon Musk says that boring industries are the best things to invest in or to work on entrepreneurship in, right? Like cars, who would like come and innovate cars, or energy, right? And in the context of digital native technologies, cloud computing, I think, is one of the most boring things. By now, it's been so commoditized that it's like almost, you don't see new players. It's basically Microsoft with Azure and AWS, Amazon and Google. There is no like small cloud providers which are like full cloud solutions. There's only like SaaS style cloud. So we actually, with Bitfwd, we invested and are operating 7% of a network called Aleph, which is a fully decentralized cloud computing. So we have elastic cloud capabilities there. You do indexing for different use cases. You do storage. it's a beautiful project, which is, it's very like unsexy in the context of like, oh, it's not the latest NFT drop with the celebrity or something, you know, it's like something that is like super reliable and dependable for applications to run truly decentralized and not to be like decentralization theater that I mentioned briefly earlier, right? So these are just like, you know, to share about like 2 examples. Can talk about other stuff more later. Curious to hear from Sean.
I definitely love my boring
Yeah.
company. So yeah, Sean, maybe you could tell us some of
I
the.
was just gonna say anything that Naval says is a good investment strategy to base a fund off. But yeah, they're super interesting companies, and we're also really bullish on the idea of decentralized security as well. I think an interesting one, which I want to pivot to, we've made an investment in the space, but I'll give an example of a really cool company. So there's a huge problem with people in China order beef from other countries, Australia, and it's hard to verify the provenance of that meat. So sometimes there'll be counterfeits and they'll say the meat is Australian beef when it's actually like from a different country. And so it's a huge problem. And there's actually 2 Aussie entrepreneurs with a company called Origin. And so what they've built is like a B2B2C company where basically when you export into China and a consumer can go to the item, say it's beef, say it's cheese or wine, and they can scan a QR code. And once they've scanned that code and the item's been purchased, it will actually close a loop and it can be verified the provenance on a blockchain. And I think that's really exciting and really interesting because it doesn't really get a lot of attention in the Web3 crypto space, is these kind of like more, as Dan would say, unsexy use cases. And I think it speaks to the promise of using them for source of truth and supply chain provenance. And so that's a really interesting use case. We've actually made an investment into a company called Ligon, which is probably the most unsexy Web3 investment I would say ever. It's basically digitizing bank guarantees and putting them on chain, which sounds very boring. But if you think about it, there's actually 60 million paper-backed guarantees. That's like physical paper that someone has to read, process. It's a huge drain on the economy in terms of fraud, in terms of inefficiency, and also like who the hell wants to be dealing with paper guarantees every day. And so this team is basically digitizing it, putting it on a private blockchain. Initially, it's starting quite centralized, I would say, but like the major banks are running the nodes, but like the founder, Justin, is very much part of this community and wants to try and decentralize it as much as he can over time. And so I think that's a super interesting area that doesn't really get as much of an investment focus is these private ledgers and these like kind of back office like source of truth supply chain style businesses.
Yeah, totally. And Sean, from Aura's investment thesis, it's clear that in order to onboard the next billion users onto Web3, there needs to be this like underlying infrastructure that needs to be built first. So how do you envision that being built, and what exactly does that look like?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it helps to build off what Dan was talking before. Was if you look at the traditional kind of compute stack, you've got your servers, you've got like your UX UI that the customer interacts with, and there's a whole bunch of middleware between. Basically, what's happening is every single stage is being disrupted by Web3 companies. And so just to kind of flesh out the storage example, let's get really deep into it and try and use it like a topical example. So say like the New York Times in a particular country wants to write an article and they're hosting it. That's generally hosted on AWS. And so like it's foreseeable to imagine a world where AWS says, look, we don't want to host this. It's too controversial. We're going to stop posting the website. What a lot of these decentralized compute, decentralized cloud is basically allowing is it's censorship resistant because it's stored on lots of little nodes that don't have the ability to actually pull what they're hosting. And so that's kind of like an example in the decentralized compute. There's also decentralized storage, which is very similar. It's like you're storing something almost like a Horcrux from Harry Potter across like a wide network, and you have to have the encryption key to access all of it. And so there's some really exciting stuff. There's going to be a whole bunch of Web3 companies which disrupt the consumer side of the internet, and they're, as crypto native companies, going to be more likely to want to use crypto native backend. And so like as our investment thesis, to be honest, I have no skill in picking what the next NFT project will be. I have zero skill in that at all. But what we can understand is what is a compelling value proposition from the back end for these crypto companies. And so if we're going to take a long-term bet that the number of consumer crypto companies is going to go up over time, I think we can be fairly comfortable that investments into the back end, if you will grow. And so we're looking for these infrastructure companies. And so I think in our kind of thesis, which we've published, you can see the whole stack and where that's unbundling. So for example, like Immutable, they're in like very much like that layer 2 scaling, which we're interested in, and kind of everything which is in the back end and servicing this growing sea of crypto companies.
I just wanted to add, so I do agree that Web3 infrastructure is disrupting the centralized platforms like Azure, Amazon, AWS. However, just based on my experience building dApps, decentralized applications like NFT marketplaces, we are not only using this decentralized infrastructure like NFT storage, which is using Filecoin and basically decentralized storage, IPFS. So not only are we using IPFS, we also need to use storage on AWS as well. Because if we think about when we're going on OpenSea and we expect the page to be really responsive, so all the images to be loaded within 2 seconds of us jumping onto the home page. So that doesn't exactly happen sometimes when we're pulling images from IPFS. So the loading time could be anywhere up to a minute sometimes, depending on how many images you're trying to load on that page. So for many applications that I've helped clients build, we actually store these images, so the NFT images, on a centralized database, and we pull from that centralized database so we can display it onto, the website, so that it does give that Web 2 responsive, responsiveness that users are used to.
Yeah, that's the reality of today, and it's practically what is done, just like you're describing. But eventually, this is the problem that Filecoin and Aleph and other companies are trying to solve. And I think that while pragmatically for the short term it feels okay, what has been proven time and time again with crypto is that essentially we are disrupting what institutions are, institutions being financial institutions and being government and governance institutions. And then when you're touching things that are a little bit too sensitive and you're suddenly prone to be censored and shut down and subpoenaed and all kind of legacy nation states, attempting to not be phasing out, then suddenly, like, the fact that you are using centralized element into your stack becomes, not just like, oh, we can now, we need to like cease and desist. It suddenly like becomes a liability. So then you see how with the maturity of the space, there is gradual migration to decentralize more than only the security and settlement layer, which is the base layer. Now, like the storage and compute that is on AWS today for a lot of application, eventually will have to be decentralized, or it will be heavily regulated and will defeat the purpose of the entire, creating new institutions that are digital native. But of course, this is like a bit more on the philosophical, like erring on the philosophical raison d'etre of why we're doing, crypto in the first place.
So pivoting slightly, actually, Daniel, you launched Blockathon DAO earlier this year, which is a Web3 Learn to Earn program. I was hoping you could speak a little bit about your motivation behind that and what you see that becoming.
That goes back to when we started Bitfwd in 2000, late 15, early 16. At the time, we didn't kind of have a plan to become a hedge fund, and we just thought that it's going to be interesting to provide a space for people for nerds that care about the technology and for people that want to commercialize technology to come together and basically move the space forward, hence Bitfwd, and at the time we were running blockchain hackathons, aka blockathons, IRL, so it would be mostly in UNSW. So like I was at the time enrolled in UNSW, later dropped out to focus on building Bitfwd and doing stuff through Bitfwd. And as over the years, I realized that doing open source and community is really fun. And it's like personally maybe very rewarding, but it's really hard to monetize. So I realized, okay, I actually want to focus on venture building and investing for the sake of monetization. But then in order to still provide this neutral environment for developers and creators to come together and do the early stage discovery, non-committing kind of things that hackathons allow, we want to actually separate it. And then earlier this year, as we were progressing with Bitfwd Capital as the hedge fund, we basically spun out the Blockathon DAO, which would be its own independent entity that doesn't necessarily have to be only projects that are related to Bitfwd Capital. Actually, quite a few of the projects that came through the Blockathon or the ecosystems that came through the Blockathon are things that Bitfwd didn't have direct involvement with. And the rationale for that is that what we see is that in a digital native environment, being the internet, a digital native environment, we want to provide education experiences as public good. And for those that aren't familiar with the topic of public good by definition is a non-exclusionary, non-rivalry service or space. It could be in the physical world, a park or a road or infrastructure for water or electricity potentially. And in the digital world, it could be blockchain networks themselves, like base layers like Bitcoin. They don't exclude people. You can open an account. But then in extension to the networks themselves, we believe that education should also be non-exclusionary, non-rivalry, and basically everyone should be entitled for educational experiences. Hence, we're looking at developing different mechanisms by which people can learn about crypto and earn while they're learning. So hence learn to earn. Kind of as a, there was the popular meme of play to earn with Axie Infinity and some other games. So we believe that the best game in the world is entrepreneurship, because entrepreneurship is basically like, it's a fractal, right? One entrepreneur that has been hit with the entrepreneurship virus can never go back to corporate and can never go back to do something that is not entrepreneurship. And then people that work with them as well. And basically it's becoming this fractal engine for innovation. And that's how society moves forward. So hence the rationale for why we do Blockathon. It's basically public good commons for entrepreneurial education in digital native blockchain. That's, I guess, yeah, in a nutshell, the why. I have a post that I written on it. Happy to share the link in the chat here shortly.
Yeah, beautiful. And definitely would love to see that link. Now, Alyse, you know, DAOs are a pretty novel structure. You know, I think they probably came into popular circulation last year with the Constitution DAO. I was hoping you could speak a little bit about how you actually participate in the DAO and how tokens and NFTs are actually involved in that process as well.
Okay, so the first one, how you participate in a DAO. So there's private DAOs and then there's public DAOs. So with private DAOs or permission DAOs, you need to apply to be a member. So they care about your credentials. They care about, you know, the quality of the membership of the DAO. But with public DAOs, for example, Uniswap is a public DAO. Gitcoin is a public DAO. They're all governed as DAOs. Then anyone can just buy one of their tokens, like the Uni token or Gitcoin. I forgot what is it, Git token. And then once you buy their token, then you are basically a member of that DAO, which gives you rights. So these rights can be voting rights in terms of being able to vote on proposals that the DAO has put forward in terms of how they want to govern their protocol or their community. Or it could even give you a right to any distributions that the DAO may make based on any profit that they may be generating, for example. So with the, what did I want to say? So with the private DAOs or the, I don't know, permission DAOs, what you'll find is a lot of these are your investment DAOs. So a lot of the people who want to invest as a DAO, they usually do it as part of a private DAO. And I suppose that makes sense because you need to have people in that DAO who understand how to source quality investments and just know how to pick winners, basically. So a lot of these investment clubs, they're set up as investment clubs, and a lot of them use the syndicate platform because it makes it very easy to manage your membership of the DAO. Also, it helps you to create this legal entity wrapper around what you do as an investment club DAO, which is quite important. So a lot of the early DAOs, they didn't really think about the legal aspect of it and thinking about how they could make sure that they're not open for legal liability or personally liable. So that's why a lot of people have been going for LLCs, and they're going through the syndicate model, the syndicate platform to do this. And that's what we've done for FuturDAO as well, because it's one of the lower cost ways to do a DAO with a legal wrapper around it. How DAOs relate to NFTs, I believe you asked, and DeFi. So I like to just kind of take a step back. So a DAO, decentralized autonomous organization, it's really, just think of it as a community of people who come together. They usually have some shared goal, and then they do some collective decision making, and they usually pull some money together. In the case of investment DAO, they're pooling their crypto or the actual fiat together, so they could invest in whatever they've chosen to. A hotel could be NFTs, etc. So this is where NFTs come in. So you'll find a couple of DAOs, types of DAOs. I like to bucket them into 3 categories. So like a social DAO, like friends with benefits. It could be a product, service, or protocol DAO like Uniswap. It is governed. It's a protocol that's governed as a DAO. Or it could just be investment DAO. So you have things like Metacartel, Flamingo DAO. Flamingo DAO is one that invests in NFTs. So when we're looking at how do all these concepts fit together, so you have a lot of NFT communities that they're essentially a DAO. So Bored Ape Yacht Club, even before they launched the ApeCoin DAO, they were actually kind of governed as a DAO, sort of. You have a lot of DAOs, they call themselves DAOs, even though they're quite centralized in terms of decision making. So I don't know, as long as people, there is a new definition that's coming out that people say, as long as membership is recorded on a blockchain, then it is a DAO, even if it's centralized and it's human governed and not truly autonomous. So you have a lot of famous NFT collections such as Lazy Lions and the Bored Ape Yacht Club NFTs, which are governed with the DAO. DeFi protocols are also DAOs as well, Uniswap, SushiSwap, etc.
Yeah, awesome. So I actually wanted to just touch on something you said earlier. So I'm just curious, is there any concern for like the sophistication of like the investors who are a part of this DAO? Collectively, you're dealing with large sums of money. Is there any concern that maybe they don't have the level of sophistication to make these investments, or do you think that's sufficiently curbed with the like vetting process that you mentioned in these private DAOs?
Yeah, it's a good question. So a lot of people are looking at DAOs as a way to democratize investment, because people are not happy with the fact that you need to be a sophisticated investor or have at least 1.2 mil in net assets to be able to get access to investments like investing in startups. So people are thinking, well, let's turn to DAOs as a way to get around that. Another way that the members in our DAO, we don't have to have everyone as a sophisticated investor, because that creates a lot of barriers, and it's kind of against the Web3 ethos as well. So as long as you're not investing in startup equity or any securities, then you don't need to be a sophisticated investor. This is, I mean, of course, get your own legal advice, but usually if it's not securities, if it's just tokens, so it could be like utility tokens, you can still invest in it as a non-sophisticated investor. Having said that, I think it is important to have people who understand investing, understand the risks involved as well, to be part of any investment community that you're part of.
I wanted just to comment about the topic of, so DAOs, DAO has the letter D in it, decentralization. And this is a little bit confusing because there were a lot of discussions in the early days of DAO experimentation, 2018, 19, that, oh, this organization is not a DAO because it's too centralized. It's actually just a multi-sig for some committee, which is like a board members. And in some senses, this argument is correct. But then at the same time, like Alyse was saying, the definition for what is a DAO is kind of, you know, there's a full spectrum for it. And one of the products that we incubated called DeepDAO, it's an analytics tool for DAOs, kind of like Etherscan for DAOs or something like this, or CoinGecko for DAOs. And we list everything. We list all of those organizations, so long as they have a significant enough economic scale. And in some sense, like, I used to be kind of like decentralization purist in the DAO space, and was like thinking that Moloch DAOs, for example, are too much like a multisig. Over the years, I mellowed enough to think that now DAOs are basically digital native organizations. It's digital native entities that coordinate towards productive output. And that's it. It's like, it will take shape in many forms. Like you have today Facebook groups, or you have Reddit threads, that all of those sometimes are, they have a community that shares some interest. And so long as they are able to coordinate towards productive output using on-chain, you know, verifiable interactions, that should be classified or should be qualified as a DAO, in my personal opinion. But this is like very hot debate for decentralization purists.
Yeah, awesome. So again, pivoting slightly, I was hoping you guys could speak to how investing in Web3 projects differs to just investing in your conventional companies. So Sean, maybe you can kickstart us.
Sure. I'm so grateful you didn't just ask me about DAOs, because following Alyse and Dan would have been a very difficult act. But in terms of the differences between traditional equity investments and investing in kind of tokenized rounds, the key difference, there's a few. I'd say one is control. Like typically as a VC, we take a board seat on the companies that we invest in. And so that's very difficult, obviously, when it's a decentralized organization. And so a lot of VCs have actually shifted their model slightly and kind of like let go of the reins a little bit of control, and have ceded the board seat and just accepted that this is kind of a new model and that they're going to have DAOs. So that's kind of the first key difference, is control. The second for us is just kind of the boring stuff about making a token investment and the different kind of regulations that we have to jump over versus a traditional equity investment. But like, those are the two kind of key things. Also, as an aside, like, and I'm sure Alyse and Dan could testify to this, like investing in Web3 6 months ago was a very different game to what it's like investing now. Like, it used to be like, you'll get a message on Telegram, the founder would say like, I have no deck, here's the white paper, read it, I can't take any more calls. And you'd be like, okay. Whereas now it's shifted a lot. And I think it's actually a breath of fresh air, because you can have a bit more time and actually think about whether this is going to be an enduring business, as opposed to just investing in things purely because there's like Signal or Gary V's invested in it. There's actually a bit more time to be thoughtful and really understand what the company's trying to do.
Like, maybe like to start off, I'll say that it's all exactly the same. It's actually like exactly the same. If you think about it like abstractly, eventually you're allocating capital and you are basically hopefully there to support founders long term. generate value to society and make a dent in the universe, right? But then, like, of course, when you get into the like mechanics of how things work, then naturally there are things that are different. One of them being, for example, that in the majority of the cases, blockchain ventures are the jurisdiction that they exist in is the blockchain. That means that, you know, sometimes you'd have an investor that is like a firm, say like a Sydney-based VC that is investing only in Australian companies, right? This game doesn't work in blockchain, in my opinion. Like, sure, you have some investors that are like, oh, I'm going to invest only in New York investors. I have like a friend that they are basically a firm that only invests in New York founders. They love New York. They want to see more young people disrupting old money in New York and create new stuff. You have in Australia investors that invest only in Australia. In my opinion, like trying to play that game in crypto is like, it's just like antithetical to the whole like digital native essence of what crypto is. So this is like one thing. And that doesn't only change just the cultural thing alone. It also means that in terms of product market fit, what you're striving for when you're looking at product market fit in firms or protocols that you're backing, then you're looking at either global market from day one or digital native market, probably more likely from day one, right? So these are maybe like things that are very different. And another thing that is, at least for the time being, different is that there is a lot less formalities in the blockchain world, for better and worse, actually. Like, there's so much amazing knowledge from traditional venture capital that some of it has been like sadly like dropped out of the window, and then like people have to learn it through painful experiences. That there's so much wisdom in, you know, like the lessons from Paul Graham. His essays are great. If you guys are not familiar with, can also drop the link. His essays about entrepreneurship and investment are just amazing, right? And all those things actually are totally applicable to crypto. Just you need to kind of change the framework through which you're considering, you know, that you're not just located in one locality as Silicon Valley or Sydney or Shenzhen or whatever. But you know, the mental models, all of those are just like super important, and many of them are sadly like skipped in crypto. And I think that, you know, the better quality founders and investors are actually quite receptive to learn from, you know, decades of wisdom from those things. So yeah, these are like maybe things that I observed that are slightly different.
Yeah, I agree with Daniel. It's pretty much the same as investing in any other tech company. So I'm not a professional investor. I'm more of a builder. So I've built several ventures, startups in tech, Web3. And so I guess the perspective I bring is that I can call bullshit on when people say, yeah, this isn't viable, or they're saying they could release something in 3 months with just one dev. But what I do is I work with people who are professional investors, because it's exactly, they have a lot of investing experience, and their knowledge is just so valuable to investing in Web3. It's just that the new thing to them might be the tokenomics part, and just understanding the technology that underpins all these new, you know, Web3 applications that we're seeing. So if you actually go onto our FuturDAO website or our Discord, we have actually open sourced, you know, our VC scorecard. So just like all VCs, like we're also using a scorecard as part of our investment DAO, and anyone can see it. So if you're pitching us for investment, then you know what matters to us. So if you look at the scorecard, it's exactly the things that like traditional VCs would look at. And then the extra section we have is just really around the blockchain / tokenomics part. So we kind of just want to know, well, what network are you building on, or you're building your own network? We want to know about, like, are you releasing tokens? If you are, then what's the tokenomics around that? What's your total supply? Is it inflationary, deflationary, etc.? That's the only difference.
Look, it's no secret that we're in a pretty nasty bear market. I mean, I know personally I'm too scared to open my Binance account. What do you think, maybe Sean, we'll start off with you. What do you think has been the biggest driver for the current market conditions, and where can we expect it to go in the coming months or years even?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's interesting. I think the biggest driver of a lot of this has been the pursuit of yield as opposed to the pursuit of like value. And I kind of need to elaborate on that a bit more. But if you look at gaming, for example, in DeFi, so much of the focus has been on play to earn, like with Axie Affinity and these models, which players like incentivizes players to play games which might not actually be that fun, but there's some financial incentive. And you can see the same in DeFi, like with these 20% yields that you're getting, and like the hedge funds that are taking this enormous amount of risk. And I think there's a common thread. I think there's too much of a focus on yield as opposed to building quality products. And so if you look at gaming, like when you look at traditional games like Blizzard and those studios, like they're not building games which focus on how to make like a rewarding financial model. They're building rewarding games. Just the same as if you look at financial markets, like people are building financial products which have risk adjusted and they're quality products. And I think so much of the new money that's coming in is just chasing so much yield that it's led to just like a massive amplifier effect of risk. And so we're seeing a lot of those people in DeFi who are just chasing yield, people in Axie and Zrun losing a lot of money because they weren't actually people who love the products. And so I can't make any predictions about what will happen, but I can only talk about what I think is useful if it did happen. And that would be for the Web3 community to focus more on actually creating value for users and simplifying it. Like, I think there's a lot of great attributes to the Web3 community, like openness, like open source software, but I think there's a lot of toxic traits. And the biggest one is complexity. Like people almost like think it's like your IQ is correlated with how difficult it is to explain something to someone. And like, no offense to Balaji, but like I feel like he's like a huge like guilty of this. And Naval's like the counterbalance where he says things just beautifully and very simply. But like the Web3 is not going to be around or onboard a significant amount of users if there's just this focus on really complex jargon and we're yield farming. It's like, let's actually create products of value that other people other than this small community of people enjoy using. And to be honest, to achieve that, like I think a lot of teams should disconnect from crypto Twitter. They should disconnect from calling themselves like block of crypto and being so aligned with that community. And they should focus on using the technology to create value for people, which has always been like the original promise.
Yeah, I like it. By the way, you know that Naval and Balaji are besties. I don't know if you know what it's
Yin and yang.
I think maybe Sam, to just comment on your saying that like it's pretty tough market. On the one hand, it's tough market compared to where like how frothy it was a few months ago. On the other hand, like it really depends on what game you play in that market. And in some sense, like we're doing something now at the moment with the Bitfwd Capital that I believe the market conditions are pretty much like optimal for us because I mean, as a hedge fund, on the one hand, you can like take risks that are like really terrible and then like end up, 3AC, like they basically had to be forced into liquidation. Or you can set up your strategy such that, oh, now it's bear market, then it means that I'm going to start accumulating shortly. And that means that if the thesis of crypto plays out and once the macro correlation of crypto now is really tight, like once we recover a little bit from this depressed macro markets, then it will be much easier to generate profits from where we are today than from where we were half a year ago or a year ago, right? So in some sense, actually today is fantastic market to start a fund, for example, right? And then, you kind of asked, so how does crypto play in the next 6 or whatever months? I think that the way that I see it, but this is super macro, so it's not like an investment advice. I mean, nothing that we said today is investment advice. It's just really like how do you go about, how do you justify dedicating time to this space, right? You basically have natural market cycles where when certain level of maturity of the technology arrives, then certain narratives emerge, and then it justifies new capital influx. And that capital influx result in growth of new products. So if in the first kind of like hype market, I'd say it was exchanges back, building an exchange was a novelty in 2012, 13. And then suddenly the fact that you were able to use exchange was attracting a lot of people that otherwise would not go about Reddit and some anonymous shady forums to buy a Bitcoin so that they can buy recreational substances on Silk Road. Instead, you could go on exchange and basically transfer fiat and buy Bitcoin. This was a thing, right? Then eventually it crashed, and there was also the Mt. Gox case. And then later, a few years after, came ICOs. So ICOs was like a novelty. The fact that you are able to do capital formation fundraising without having to do like a traditional company, just doing a token issuance. Send me Bitcoin, I'll send you a token, or send me ETH, I'll send you a token. And then naturally, like it got abused, and people would be like doing an ICO project for the sake of doing an ICO project. And then it has to crash. So every time you kind of like have this maturity of technology, and then abuse of the fact that there's a bit of hype, and then a correction, and then a maturity again. So now the most recent hype cycle was DeFi initially, then NFT and DAOs a little bit. And the beauty of this current wave that is very different to every other time that we had a growth, like kind of a growth peak, is that now crypto is tightly correlated to macro markets. So you have things that are basically at the scale of traditional finance. For example, the Luna crash and the 3AC crash, they're already at the scale of when Lehman Brothers was falling down, right? And then you have participants in that market that are playing that same game of traditional finance. So at this stage of crypto, it really is starting to enter that realm of finance, just without just being native to crypto and isolated from that, right? And the way that I see it is, if you look at the overall market capitalization of the space. So when I dropped out of my PhD to work full-time on crypto, the entire market cap of crypto was about $15 billion. So I remember an investor was telling me, why do you care about this entire market if it's like barely valued as Twitter, which was it's much smaller at the time? And then you can see it's true. It's really just toy for nerds. But then we reached 800 billion by the end of that other cycle. And we reached 3 trillion by the end of, or by the peak of this cycle. And with every wealth level that we reach in a growth cycle, it's not so much about like, oh, money and profit. It's about the scale of capital is able to be engaged in different kind of realms in society. So for example, hardcore physical infrastructure, imagine telecommunication, for example, right? It's capital intensive industries, or semiconductors, capital intensive industries, right? You need to arrive at a certain wealth level for an industry to start being involved in this. So just as the internet used to be a nascent thing that eventually ended up, like Google ended up disrupting telecommunication with Google Fi, right? Similarly, the way that I see it, if we're at, like we reached that peak level of 3 trillion in the peak, the next peak would probably be 5 to 10. At this scale of wealth, we are going to already start seeing things that are creeping into like real society things, not just toy for nerds and investors, right? And that's something that's super interesting. And it's, I think by this stage, it's also, I think betting against it happening, it's not even about ideology of crypto as much. It's just betting against progression and advancement in technology at this stage. Because crypto is like a general purpose technology. It's not like oh, this is only like a tool for X or something. It's like finance is not a tool for one thing. It's a tool for operating system for societies, right? So betting against it is just it's a losing game for sure. And now, like, just brace for the winter, and find a way to catch the wave for when the spring comes again, right? Like find a good position. So understand what are the things that you want to incubate. In the winter, it's a good time to grow, for example, like broccoli and bok choy and things that are growing in this thing, and be a cockroach. In the summer, maybe, sure, like you get tanned as a unicorn and eat pina colada or durian from northern Queensland or something, but these are, I guess, like fetishes for another time.
I just want to add that so I work for a innovation consultancy, and we do a lot of Web3 projects. I have to say that it hasn't slowed down for us. Like, we are busier than ever with Web3 projects, but the type of projects have shifted. So we're doing a lot of NFT projects. No one really wants to touch DeFi, stable coins, anything that have to do with financial regulation. So that's why we're seeing a lot of NFT projects around customer engagement, or even like fan engagement. So things like fan tokens, membership tokens, then the tokenization of physical or like non-on-chain items like fashion and music as well. So yeah, a lot of like brand projects are happening. And also talking to a couple of investors. So in Europe and also in Southeast Asia. So I just came back from Singapore, and they are also saying that they are more interested in incubating and also in investing in more NFT projects. So like more the safe, fun stuff, really around like brand and customer engagement. So the market has been affected, but in the last couple of months, we've had a lot of funds raise Web3 specific. A lot of Web3 investors raise Web3 specific funds. So in Singapore alone, I think there's been 3 in the last couple of months. In Australia, not too sure about the market there, but like in Europe, there's lots happening. And in the States, people are really optimistic. Like a lot of my friends came back from NFT NYC, and they're like, they don't see the pessimism that we are experiencing here, because everyone's still pretty bullish on NFTs at least. So I think there's probably region specific, and probably because we're just kind of in a bubble sometimes, but I think there's still a lot of activity happening. Investors are more cautious, and they're moving to different areas instead, but there's still a lot of undeployed capital and new funds being raised.
Yeah, right. So maybe like the makeup of the deal flow is changing a little bit. Yeah, right. So much to unpack there, and I've got a bunch more questions, but I think it's only fair that we hand it over to the audience to ask a couple of questions of their own. So Sharon, I might just hand it over to you.
Yeah, so we've got a question here. So Alyse, could you speak on what DAO creation platform you have experience with, and what would you recommend?
Okay, so for DAOs, you can use DAO as a service platforms, which do everything in one, or you could just use like composable tools. Composability, like having Lego blocks, it's a big thing in Web3, and I prefer that for launching a DAO. So when you're looking at the platform or DAO as a service, there's DAO House, Aragon, they're very popular. Everything is done within their platform, so you're kind of locked into their ecosystem. Or you could do composable. So what do you need, like basically as a DAO? First, you need a way to hold funds and like give different parties access to these funds. And 2, you probably need a way to manage voting on decisions you're going to make. So for us, we've gone with NosaSafe, a multi-sig wallet, where we can all pool our money together, and we can choose who has access to it. You never want just one person in your organization too. The second is we're using Snapshot. All the big DAOs use Snapshot, including Bitcoin, ENS. So it's just a way where it allows you to log in with your crypto wallet, and it will authenticate you, basically saying, oh, you have this DAO's token. You can now create or vote on proposals. But you don't even really need to go that far. Like, you could even have a bank account if you're going to deal with fiat, and then you can just have a chat group like WhatsApp, Discord, even, as long as you can vote and discuss as a group.
Yeah, great. And we don't have a question here, but I think from a venture perspective, how do you think about switching costs for users? So what does it take for a customer to move from one platform to another? So maybe I'll ask Sean for this one.
Yeah, so it's an awesome question. Switching costs is like one of the 7 powers. I'm not sure if you've read that's where it comes from, but it's a huge framework that we look for when we evaluate businesses. Some of the other ones include like economies of scale, process power, accounting positioning. But it's a great question, and it kind of, switching costs, I feel like in DeFi has been like switching yield. It's been just like migrating to whichever protocol has the higher yield. And so I think it's actually less about, like, I think switching costs comes from building community as opposed to just making things purely financial. Because as I said, like, it's, if you have financial incentives, people will always switch to follow the highest yield. And so how do you develop like stickiness in product? How do you develop stickiness of community? How do you develop these things around it such that the switching cost is not just purely a function of yield?
Great. And yeah, I think maybe a last question here is, are there any barriers in tech that even Web3 cannot overcome with decentralization?
It's a very steep learning curve, right? It's like, for most people to just get in the space, it's such a headache, like learning, about seed phrase and wallets and why you should keep your own keys and not keep it on exchange. And like get wrecked a few times until you learn stuff like that, and lose keys. And there's just like so many barriers. And also culture wise, like sometimes people complain about it being too dominated by males, for example, right? And I think one of my favorite, there was a question earlier, like give an example for an investment DAO. There is an investment DAO called Como Rebi, I think, which is focused on, I think, female, bi, trans, whatever founders, right? I think this is a really good example for how you have both an investment and some kind of a social cause or impact mission, right? And it's a really important cause, because really, if you look at the profile of majority of the founders, it's I guess I fall into the category here too, but it's like basically white males geeks. Not only white males, a lot of Asians and other, but basically male geeks as well, right? And oftentimes it creates an uninviting environment. And then there's also like Sean was mentioning earlier, there's jargon and things that are like sounding too complex, and someone feels like, oh, I don't have a PhD in math, I can't get into the space. So I think it's both on the kind of culture as well as technology that we have work to do on lowering the barrier of entry to the space. And yeah, I think that hopefully these events and the hackathon events and stuff, it's environments for people to come and get more like easily involved.
Yeah, for sure, like a blockathon. Yeah, well, that's great. I think that wraps up our Q&A session. I'll pass it back to Sam to wrap it up.
Yeah, so thank you so much, guys, for answering those questions tonight. Incredibly insightful answers, really appreciate it. I think the audience got a lot out of it as well. So we'll leave it there. To wrap up, I'll just remind the audience to make sure to check out Textbook Ventures on our socials, especially LinkedIn.